Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
We're hearing from Sir Martin Donnelly.
Yes.
Almighty God,
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
and
nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down.
Please, can you state your full name?
Martin Eugene Donnelly.
Thank you for attending the inquiry today to give oral evidence, and thank you for your detailed witness statement, to which I would like to turn now. It should be in front of you. Do you have a copy of it? Do you see that?
Yes, I have my own copy.
And it runs to 33 pages, excluding the list of exhibits. Could I ask you, please, to turn to page 33?
Yes?
Is that your signature?
Yes.
Now, before I ask you whether that's true to the best of your knowledge and belief, there's one correction I understand we need to make. If we could have paragraph 6 on the screen, please, which is at page 3. In the middle of the third line, it says, I joined Boeing in July 2019 and worked as UK Managing Director until October 2023. I understand that should read October 2022.
Yes.
Thank you. That can come down. Subject to that one correction, are the facts stated in that witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief? They
are.
Thank you. That, for the reference, is WITN 11250-100. Sir Martin, that statement will be uploaded to the inquiry's website shortly. I'm going to ask you some questions on it, not on everything, but on some certain matters. We'll start with your career. You joined the civil service in 1980.
Yes.
And you held a range of positions across a number of departments, being made acting permanent Under-Secretary to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 2010.
That's right.
You were then made Permanent Secretary to the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills in October 2010.
Yes.
You remained in that post until that department closed and became the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in July 2016.
Yes. In practice then, parts of the department were split off. The core department had the energy part joined onto it, and then I was briefly a joint permanent secretary while setting up the separate Department of International Trade.
And you served as permanent secretary of the new Department for International Trade, I believe in September 2016 to April 2017.
Yes.
And at that point you left the civil service.
That's correct.
So Martin, you are the first permanent secretary we've heard evidence from, so I want to touch on the role of permanent secretary first. You say in your statement, we don't need to turn it up, paragraph 10, that the role of permanent secretary is to be the civil service head of department.
That's correct, the senior permanent civil servant in the department.
In respect of your role as permanent secretary and fulfilling that role, did you have a private office or staff to assist you with that?
Yes, I did.
Could you just summarise the extent of the private office or staff you had to help?
So I had, over most of this time, a principal private secretary, usually 2 junior private secretaries to assist, a diary secretary and some clerical support.
We'll come to their roles in due course as we go through your evidence. I want to look at the department itself as well, the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. Please could we bring up paragraphs 7 and 8 of your statement, which is on page 3. So we see a section giving an overview of the department. You refer to the creation of the department in 2009. That's before your appointment. You go on to say at paragraph 8 that the department had a very wide range of specific responsibilities within its central objective of promoting economic growth through investment in skills and education, trade and investment promotion, fostering innovation, and helping businesses to grow. How did postal affairs and oversight of the post office fit within the department?
The department was probably the widest range of responsibilities I came across in my time as a civil servant. It was the post office, together with Royal Mail, of course, at the start of this period, was one of about 45 partner organisations which were split up in terms of their supervision between different parts of the department. The post office was one of 6 or so, which was supervised by the shareholder executive, and that arrangement remained the case throughout my time as permanent secretary.
You do go on to say in your statement about the range and extent of the functions being large. The extent of the functions the department had, do you think that had a negative effect on its ability to oversee postal affairs as an individual issue or area?
It certainly had consequences for how we had to do it. Given the range of responsibilities, it was necessary to delegate considerably within the department into the various groups. And for most of the time I was there, certainly by the end, we had 6 separate groups with their own responsibilities. Whether that was better or worse than other models is difficult to say in abstract. What I would say, and you may want to come back to this separately, is we were, from the time that I joined, and increasingly over that period, under considerable resource pressure, or to put it more bluntly, we didn't have as much funding or as many people as we would have liked to have had to do all the things that we had to do. So we had to do the best we could with what we had. But in terms of structures, I thought at the time that the structures we had were reasonable ones.
I will come back to the point of the resourcing you refer to later. In terms of at a department level, I think in your statement you refer to personal involvement in the sale of Royal Mail and an accounting issue with Post Office Limited's consolidated accounts towards the end of 2015. Is that broadly right? Those were the 2 areas in which you had personal involvement.
Yes, and in the first case, that was because of my specific accounting officer responsibility for the public assets, which were the Royal Mail, which were being sold, and the question of whether the taxpayer was getting value for money for them. That was my role as accounting officer, and it was a specific one in that case. In the second case, which was a bit different, I was actually annoyed by the fact that the post office had made this accounting error, because although the accounts were their responsibility, within the business department we tried very hard to, and I think succeeded, in achieving a high level of financial transparency. Accounts were produced on time, our departmental accounts were not qualified, and I was angry that the post office had messed this one up, and I had to report it in the report and accounts for that year.
Given those were, we'll come back to some of those later, given those were the 2 issues you're involved with, is it fair to say that postal affairs or the post office wasn't one of the top agenda items for the department as a whole whilst you were permanent secretary?
Certainly from my perspective as permanent secretary, the major policy issue that took up most of my time was the Royal Mail privatisation. I was aware of other issues, but as across the range of the partner bodies, from the student loan company to the ordnance survey and so on, my primary concern was to ensure that these were being handled within a structure which made sense. It wasn't possible for me to follow in detail every single issue, nor would it have been desirable in terms of the responsibilities of the people involved. I relied on them to raise issues, but from my perspective, yes, those were the two salient points when the Post Office was directly on my agenda.
We'll come to your personal involvement shortly. Just to put it again, I suppose, in terms of that's what you were dealing with, in terms of what the department as a whole prioritised or had at the top of its agenda, is it fair to say that postal affairs wasn't on, say, the top 5 agenda items for the department as a whole?
Well, the top 5 agenda items shifted over time. So early on, we had a bit of a crisis over student funding. Later in my time, we had a crisis over steel. We had continued challenges over funding. We had issues around regional development coming through. We had a problem over the funding of further education colleges. So these were the issues which tended to be at the top of the political agenda and therefore affected what I was concerned with as the senior official serving the Secretary of State. But in parallel, and I don't want to sound too bureaucratic about this, but it was important. We were running a large and complex organisation, so issues around staffing, around funding, around appointments, these all came up and took up quite a lot of time, and so, of course, did reducing the funding over this period in a managed way. So the Post Office was one of the issues being dealt with within the system during this time. That's how I would put it.
Let's look at your role, I think touching on what you just said. Could we look at paragraph 15 of your statement? It's page 5. We see you start off describing the role of the permanent secretary. I'm not going to go through all of that, but if we go down to 17, you say, given the range of work across the core department, the permanent secretary has to ensure that systems are in place to manage it effectively without personal intervention while maintaining an overview of the department's work. And as you mentioned, in doing that, you had directors general reporting to you.
Yes.
One of those was the chief executive of the shareholder executive.
Yes.
What responsibility did you have as permanent secretary to satisfy yourself that a director general and their team were performing the role effectively?
I think that was one of my core responsibilities. It was to ensure that the system, as far as I was aware and could professionally judge, was equipped with the people and the resources and the motivation, the values, to do the jobs that it had to do in different settings. And that required looking at the funding, it required looking at the senior leadership, it required ensuring that I had time with those directors general to know what was on their minds and how I could help. And it also required letting them get on with it without excessive intervention where that was going to actually complicate their lives and make running the department as a whole more difficult.
Is it fair to summarise your evidence in terms of that reporting line as follows? You first say that you were reliant on accurate information being communicated to and by your officials.
Yes.
And secondly, you placed reliance in your officials' judgment in identifying which issues needed to be raised with you.
Yes, within the context that obviously more junior officials were being managed by more senior officials. And I would expect where there was an issue that they weren't sure about or required guidance, that they would go to the more senior officials, and where necessary, those officials would bring me in. Or the other way round, that the Secretary of State would say to me, as happened on one or two issues, have a look at this, try and sort it out. That didn't happen very often, but it did happen occasionally.
Can you recall, so you referred to conversations with your Director General. Let's focus purely on shareholder executive at the minute. Can you recall to what extent you tested whether the Director General was providing you with the appropriate information or the most relevant information for you?
Well, I guess there are two parts to that. One was I had to personally have confidence in the people doing those jobs, that they would do it them professionally and ethically. And I did have that confidence as I built my team. And secondly, they would use their judgment, which I would then rely on to inform me of issues where I could add value or where I should be aware, either for accounting officer reasons or because they would be politically important or because 10 Downing Street were involved, and so on.
My question is, how did you test that judgment to see if it was being exercised properly?
So obviously it's a judgment that I would make over time through contact with them. The other more formal arrangement was that we had an annual appraisal, and I would collect information from others with whom they worked, including their own staff, and including in the case of the shareholder executive, as a lot of its function was actually outside the business department, from others that it was working with. And I was reassured by the feedback I received.
Would one of those sources of feedback on the Director General with responsibility for shareholder executive have been the chair of Post Office Limited?
Not that I recall. I did, as you know, have separate meetings roughly once a year with the chair of the Post Office, and the chair could at any point have contacted me to say, I'm not happy with what's going on. That would have been unusual, but not completely outside normal behaviour. The process of assessment tended to be more within government, so from ministers, from other permanent secretaries, particularly the Treasury.
In your statement, we don't need to bring it up, I'll read it. In response to the types of issues that would be raised to your attention, you refer to reviewing a large amount of briefing information, and you prioritise issues that affect the whole department or top of the political agenda. When we say issues that affect the whole department, could you just say what you mean by that?
Again, this would often be questions of funding. Were we having difficulty in managing an issue which was arising, which would affect the department's effectiveness and credibility with ministers? Were we being asked by 10 Downing Street or others for a new initiative which had to be managed? Were we dealing with a sudden crisis, for example, the steel crisis, or the sort of issue that would rapidly become very political and again affect how we were perceived as doing our job? For example, student loan company difficulties at some points with their IT in delivering loans accurately to students. So they tended to be those sorts of issues, or points that I knew were on the Secretary of State's mind or were likely to come forward. But you will also understand that with 40-odd partner organisations and a very wide range of issues, there were quite a lot of problems of people resigning or questions of how we would cover emerging areas. So there was quite a lot of organisational material that would come up to me that we would be managing through the departmental board and its systems.
On reflection, the fact that there was such a broad area and issues to cover from such a wide spectrum, did that prevent, or do you think it may have prevented, issues such as the horizon issues we're looking at breaking through to the top level of the civil service?
I find that a difficult question to answer. I think I'd make 2 points. One was that because we'd set the department up with this range of responsibilities, it was inevitable that a lot of responsibility would be devolved to the Directors General. That was not necessarily a bad thing. They were competent people. It did mean, though, that there was less overall bandwidth for drilling down into individual issues. But my question to myself would be, if we had had more resource, I'm not sure it would have been best used at most senior levels. It might have been better used actually at the detailed levels of how many people were engaged in working out the detail of what was going on. Because the problem was, once you've got information coming into the system, everybody was working off the same information further up. And the challenge I see in retrospect is we weren't getting access to the correct information on which to take decisions.
Go slightly out of order because you've raised it there. You say you refer in your statement to cuts and having to cut the budget once early in the stage of the coalition government, and then the second time around in 2015 onwards. To what extent did those cuts affect the resource or headcount available to oversee post office within the department?
It's hard to make a direct connection. And as I say in my statement, I was aware of the importance of the work that Checks was doing, and indeed other parts of the department were doing. And I sought, I think with some success, to ensure that there was an acceptable level of funding and support. Now, it would have been good to have had more, and in the past there was more. And from 2015 onwards, we had to start another process which was very painful and difficult and involved the projected closure of some offices. So I think at the time I'd say it was almost less the resource levels, because nobody came to me and said, I cannot do this with the resource I have. In some policy areas, we said, well, we just can't do as much work on regional policy. We're going to have to cut this down to a minimum. But I did not get the impression the shareholder executive did not have the resources that they needed. What was true for me, and I think for my senior team, was we had to spend a lot of time trying to shrink the organisation, deal with inevitable morale issues, manage the partner organisations, and latterly some issues about the speed with which we could renew board members, because there was a degree of involvement, some would say interference by special advisors, which caused some difficulties with some partners. All of these things became very time-consuming. So keeping all the plates spinning against this complexity with limited resources didn't, in my memory, honestly, lead us to make any particular mistakes, but it did give us less thickness of people, less bandwidth.
Before I move on, on reflection, having been in the civil service for several decades, but now having left, obviously, do you have any comments to make on the size of the portfolio of the department and whether that's appropriate?
I think it comes down again to this point of how many senior officials do you need, and how do they add value? And the challenge, I think, is if you don't get additional perspectives or additional information, then they're unlikely to add a lot of value. I do think there's a question about resource levels in terms of being able to be close to or closer to what is going on. But then, of course, you have to be able to rely on the information that you are getting. So I would say in retrospect, the model of BIS had some advantages. You could link up different policy areas. You could make them work better together than if they were in separate departments. But it did have consequences for how we had to manage issues. And that meant it had a high level of devolving responsibilities.
Before I move on to look at the role of the accounting officer, just a couple of points on your knowledge. You say in your statement that you don't recall any real discussion on things like bugs and errors in the Horizon system whilst you were permanent secretary.
None at all.
When did you first become aware that Post Office conducted its own prosecutions?
Probably about 2019, I think, when I read the Nick Harvey book.
During your... Nick Wallace, sorry.
Sorry, yes.
During your period of time as permanent secretary, your evidence is you weren't aware of its prosecutorial function.
Not at all.
Were you aware that it was involved in prosecutions and that sub-postmasters were being prosecuted by someone?
No. That never came to my attention because I guess it was never connected to anything that someone said, this is important, we should be concerned about it.
I want to look at the role of the accounting officer in relation to Post Office Limited. I'll cover this in a bit of detail because you're, as I say, the first permanent secretary you have at the inquiry. You were the accounting officer for the department as permanent secretary.
Yes.
And that gave you certain personal responsibilities in respect of the department's expenditure of public money.
Yes.
Please, could we look at your statement at page 14, paragraph 38? You refer to the accounting officer role, and about 6 lines down, you say, as accounting officer, maintaining transparency of BIS spending was a key objective. This led to a successful consolidation of the accounts of most of the partners for which BIS had oversight into the main BIS accounts. However, this did not include Royal Mail and the Post Office. As noted above, they had a separate report and accounts produced to commercial standards given their status as a public corporation. I assume there, when you say a separate report and accounts, you're referring to the accounts filed at the Company's House.
Yes.
And if we look over the page, please, at paragraph 39,
Yeah.
very top, you, I think, effectively make 3 points. First, you were not the accounting officer for Royal Mail or Post Office.
Except in so far as we've discussed on the Royal Mail share sale, when it came to the disposal of public taxpayer assets, I was the person who had to provide a judgment that that was value for money.
So with that into account as well, so that's the other one. You say you're accountable as accounting officer for any transactions between Post Office and the department. Is that what you mean when you refer to being accountable there?
Yes, and hypothetically, if there had been some issue of having to be a loan or any financial arrangements which involved the department with the Post Office, I can't quite imagine what those would have been, but if they involved funding from the department, then I would have been involved as accounting officer or supervising it, yes.
So that, as I understand it, derives from your role as accounting officer to the department.
Yes.
But you are not accounting officer to the Post Office or to Royal Mail itself.
No, that, and we mentioned managing public money. That was, as far as I could see, a logical evolution of the system, that you had an arm's length body that was a public corporation, and it had a pretty high degree of autonomy, for example, on its salaries, on how many people it employed, which did not have to come to the department or ultimately to me for approval. And they did have to produce accounts to commercial standards and be audited and so on.
And you say, I think the third point you say is that public corporations do not have accounting officers. I want to look at that in a bit of detail now, but before I do, in summary, what, if any, responsibility did you have as an accounting officer in respect of post offices' accounts?
As accounting officer, I don't think I directly had a responsibility for their accounting process. I did have a wider reputational responsibility for how they were doing it, and we had the point about the non-cash error, which we discussed. And ultimately, of course, they were using public funds because they were in the public sector and the public sector stood behind them. So had they had a financial crash or run out of money, I would have had to have been involved in that residual role, but not for their normal expenditure, no.
I want to look at each of those 3 points now. Some of these may be perfectly clear to you, but so we will have to go through it stage by stage to make sure it's clear to us. The first point is you being the accounting officer, not the accounting officer, sorry, for Royal Mail and Post Office. Could we look, please, at UKGI 406045? It's a document called by the Treasury Managing Public Money, July 2013. As briefly as you can, could you summarise what this document is used for?
No, I'm not sure I can now, especially at 11 years distance. Essentially, the Treasury were trying, though, to set out a framework for broadly who was responsible for where the money went. And technically, I think my accounting officer responsibilities were delegated by the Treasury accounting officer, and similarly to other permanent secretaries. And there were practical arrangements whereby some other arm's length bodies had some quasi-accounting officer status. Now, I'm not a professional accountant, and I'm not sure I can take you much further into that. I'm also aware that the precise definition of accounting officer in the case of a public corporation was slightly work in progress over this period.
Well, let's pause that because we'll come to it shortly. Could we look, please, at page 19, paragraph 3.1.1. So this says the role of the accounting officer, and it says each organisation in central government, department, agency, trading fund, NHS body, NDPB or arm's length body must have an accounting officer. We'll leave aside public corporations for the time, but do I take it this supports your position that you were accounting officer of the department and then sponsor arm's length bodies or public corporations? Well, no, sorry.
No, not public.
Sorry. Sponsor arm's length bodies would have their own accounting officers.
It did depend on the level of autonomy of the organisation, but it is true to say that, and I don't know offhand quite what the status of the other 44 or so were in this category, but yes, there were different levels of autonomy, and with that went a different level of accounting officer responsibility. So it wasn't always entirely black and white in practice, this system.
Let's look at the public corporations role, please. And first, a point on public corporations. That document can come down for the time being. You may have listened to evidence in the inquiry's phase 5 and 6 hearings where ministers and civil servants referred to the post office as an arm's length body. Did you hear that evidence?
Yes, I heard some of it, not all of it.
Now, colloquially, that may be correct, but I understand there's a difference between a arm's length body and a public corporation for the purposes of public accounts. Is that correct?
Yes, I think arm's length body is not really a technical term. It covered a range of non-departmental bodies, and there used to be trading funds and so on. And essentially, once you had a unit with some financial autonomy outside the department, it tended to be known as an arm's length body.
Could we please look at RLIT 40325? This is a Cabinet Office document from 2016 called the Classification of Public Bodies Guidance for Departments. Is this a document you would have been familiar with when you were Permanent Secretary?
Well, I would have expected my finance team to be familiar with the detail, and I would have expected to have understood the broad lines of what they were saying about what did and did not fall within the public sector, which was not always a straightforward issue.
Can we turn to page 4, please? We see it says public bodies are diverse, which means classification is not always a simple process. For ease of reference and to help departments understand the different delivery models that exist, this guidance sets out the main categories of public bodies. This guidance covers the ALBs that are classified, that's the arm's length bodies that are classified, other non-classified central government and parliamentary entities, and public corporations. And I think your evidence before is that there are different categories of arm's length bodies that fall within the first group there, the ALBs that are classified. Is that right?
Yes. In terms of how we worked with them and managed them, that is right. And some of those categories, I'm afraid, changed over time.
Could we look at page 29, please? See, this is chapter 6 on public corporations, and on the left column towards the bottom it says a body will be classified as a public corporation where it says it is classified as a market body, a body that derives more than 50% of its production costs from the sale of goods or services at economically significant prices. This detail we don't need there. It goes on to say 2, it is controlled by central government, local government, or other public corporations, and it has substantial day-to-day operating independence so that it should be seen as an institutional separate unit separate from its parent department. And is it your evidence that the Post Office fulfilled those requirements to be a public corporation?
Definitely.
Thank you.
I can say why if you want, but that may be too much unhelpful detail.
But please do.
Well, briefly, because this is a sectoral classification issue, it's concerned with what does the government stand behind. So if a public corporation goes bust in some way or doesn't fulfill its contractual obligations, the ONS want to know what's on the government's balance sheet and how much they stand to lose. If it had a slightly different level of control that meant that it was largely, but not entirely, private sector controlled, the ONS would argue that if it went bankrupt, it was a private sector issue. So their primary concern here is to work out what assets the taxpayer is essentially responsible for, as I understand this system.
Thank you. I want to go to your evidence that public corporations do not have accounting officers. And you refer to the 2023 edition of Managing Public Money. Could we please bring that up? It's UKGI 30043211 and page 208, please. So this is obviously 2023 document. It was brought into place after after you'd left the civil service. We see towards the bottom of the box at the top, it says this annex is intended to consolidate existing guidance in relation to their responsibilities for public money and to provide some advice on common issues that arise. Could we turn, please, to paragraph 7.3.13, which is over the page, no, sorry, 2 pages over, page 210. And the last sentence says, this is the paragraph you rely on, public corporations do not have accounting officers and are not subject to managing public money as a matter of course. This sentence isn't in the 2013 edition of Managing Public Money. Is your evidence, though, that that reflects practice or reflects how government worked whilst you were Permanent Secretary?
Yes, I think it was, and I've thought about this. It was helpful, although you could argue a bit belated, to write this down in 2023 or whenever. Already when I was a Permanent Secretary, it was clear that there was not expected to be the same level of responsibility for expenditure that there was as an accounting officer within the department. So, for example, I would control gifts that came into the department, or hospitality. We would have registers. A public corporation was completely outside that arrangement. They were expected to follow commercial accounting rules. But, and this I think was where it gets a bit less clear, they were also expected to work within broad public sector parameters. So, in terms of behaviour, in terms of not going completely off the rails in their spending decisions. And I think it took some time to write down the way we were all working, which was that the logical consequence of having a public corporation with all of these other disciplines, external auditors and so on, was that the accounting officer system couldn't really function in the same way, nor should it have to, because there were other disciplines in place. But at the same time, the public corporation was going to have to go on reporting to its shareholder, if that's the right image, to government for the way it behaved.
And how was that understanding as to the public corporation acting to public standards, how was that communicated to the public corporation?
Well, again, this, I think, evolved over time. I could not point you to a specific document. From my perspective, these arrangements were managed within the shareholder executive with full approval of the Treasury. So the fact that the Royal Mail, first of all, then the Post Office became a public corporation, we appointed a board. And from my perspective, having the chief executive, the board, the auditors, meant that insofar as I reflected on the issues that were problematic, the Post Office wasn't, because it had these levels of effective control. And I was not, for example, ever called to the Public Accounts Committee to discuss the Post Office, because it was seen that that was a rather separate organisation.
If we can go down slightly, please, to show the next paragraph. Thank you. Again, referring to public corporations, it says they should instead be subject to levels of control and governance that are deemed appropriate by the sponsor department and agreed in the context of the framework document and approved by Treasury. It may be the nature of the body is such that it would be appropriate to consider if that a requirement for compliance with the principles of managing public money should be imposed. This should be achieved through the exercise of shareholder rights and is not the default position. If this outcome is sought, it may be appropriate to appoint the chief executive as an accountable person, mirroring the role of the accounting officer for central government bodies to ensure the shareholder expectations in this regard are met. Again, was that idea of how you could approach public corporations and have an accountable person within them, was that practice within government at the time you were permanent secretary?
Well, again, I wasn't close to all the detail of this, given it was being handled between Treasury, Shareholder Executive, and the finance function. But from my perspective as an accounting officer, I can see this as a logical development of what we were doing. And 7 years later, it was written down. The important step that was taken when I was permanent secretary was beginning to put civil servants on the board. And as you know, that was not uncontentious at the time. I thought it was a sensible idea, and I hoped and expected would give us an additional level of effective control without cutting across the structures that had been put in place to provide the level of operational autonomy which people wanted to the Post Office to have.
That document can come down. I'd like to go back to the 2013 version of Managing Public Money briefly, please, page 55. Sorry, that I should say UKGI 406045. Page 55, please. Towards the bottom, we should see public corporations. Thank you. So we're referring to public corporations here, and over the page at 7.7.2. It says sponsor department should define any contractual relationship with a corporate in a framework document adapted to suit the corporate context while delivering public sector discipline. At the time, were you aware of what contractual framework documents were in place to govern the relationship between Post Office and the department?
No, not in detail.
Why not?
Because there was an evolution in how the shareholder executive were working with the Post Office over this period. It came out of the Royal Mail. We set up the board. We had someone on it, and I was aware of all of that. I didn't know how far that had been written down in any contractual document, and I wasn't sure. Insofar as I thought about it, I accepted that the shareholder executive were managing this relationship as it evolved. We were putting the non-executive director on the board, and the system was providing, in substance, what was required.
Do you think it would have helped to, for example, when Post Office became an independent business, to have sat down, reviewed the business as a whole, and set down a framework as to how government oversight would work?
I think it's always helpful to have as much transparency as you can in these cases, although the fundamental thing is maintaining an open relationship of trust and transparency between the people involved. And if you don't have that, then any number of contractual documents are not going to work well, in my experience. And I think that this is a sensible way of developing the relationship, certainly when there's an element of stability involved. And I think for quite a lot of the time that we were dealing with the Post Office, there was an evolution in the development of its board and so on, and also I think some question over what the final model might be for the Post Office. So I can understand why there wasn't, as far as I know, any formal document on these lines, but I think, yes, I think it's a good idea over time to have those, in addition to the fundamental point about the relationship of trust and transparency.
Should there have been a review of the operations of Post Office Limited, including the fact it conducted prosecutions, to determine how the department would oversee prosecutions?
I speak under control here, but my understanding was that Post Office prosecutions had stopped at some point before this period.
There were ongoing prosecutions at that. It stopped shortly after separation. But let's look at it from the point of, say, 2011, when there's a plan to separate the businesses. Should the department have reviewed the operations that Post Office were carrying out, such as prosecutions, to determine how it could best oversee them?
I don't feel competent to comment on the precise nature of decisions on prosecutions. Clearly, with what we know now, it was a very peculiar system that the Post Office had in place until they no longer ran their own prosecutions, and it was not an acceptable one. And that should therefore have been picked up at some point. When I joined the department in late 2010, I wasn't aware of that level of detail of how the Post Office performed its prosecutions. In terms of the wider relationship between the department and the Post Office, my understanding was, and I think this is correct, that there was a lot of discussion about what the relationship should be as it moved out of the Royal Mail, as we moved towards the Royal Mail privatisation. And that seems to me, in substance, to fill the question of, well, how are we going to do this? We'll set up this board and so on. At some point, it was obviously sensible to codify it. I think the question as to why it wasn't done earlier, I don't know. But the key question was the system providing the information that was required by the department as a sponsor? And I did not have any reason to think, from what I was being told, that that was not the case.
I want to look at just one more point on the accounting officer's role. If we look at page 9, please, of the same document. We have responsibilities, and it sets out there the principles for managing public money. In box 1.1, we have I think it's the Nolan principles there. The accounting officer has to follow those principles when expending public money, correct?
Yes.
If we turn to page 19, please. It says the role of the accounting officer towards the bottom, please. The special responsibilities of accounting officer, in particular, the accounting officer must personally sign the accounts, the annual report, and the governance statement. And if we look there, box 3.1, standards expected of the accounting officer's organisation. So acting within the authority of the minister to whom he or she is responsible, the accounting officer should ensure that the organisation and any ALBs it sponsors, so arm's length bodies it sponsors, operates effectively and to a high standard of probity. And under governance, we can see there's work cooperatively with partners in the public interest and treat its customers and business counterparties fairly, honestly, and with integrity. Now, if Post Office was a arm's length body, a formal arm's length body to which this document applied. Does it follow that your role as accounting officer, you would have a responsibility to ensure that it treated its postmasters fairly, honestly, and with integrity?
If you go back to your previous box, I did not sign off the accounts for the Post Office. I did sign off the accounts for the business department and for those arm's length bodies that were consolidated within those accounts. So there is a significant difference here in terms of the level of control, which I just need to be clear about. However, on the wider point, yes, I think that as the senior official in the department, all the bodies, whatever their status, should have been doing all of this. And in the case of the Post Office, it clearly did not happen. So I have to accept some responsibility for the fact that one of the organizations, which was part of our overall grouping, was not meeting these standards. And I think that's appalling. And I wish we had done better.
I can come down, thank you. Let's turn then to the system of oversight, because as I understand your evidence, it's that as permanent secretary, you can't be involved in every individual minor decision. Your responsibility is to establish systems of work that ensure that, or should ensure that these ALBs and public corporations are run effectively.
Yes, and it's not just minor decisions, it's also major decisions, because when you have the level of complexity that we were dealing with, you have to be able to empower people to take decisions and follow them through in a structure, because otherwise you're not going to get effective outcomes or value for money. So it's really important that these structures are set up and are robust, because there's no alternative.
If we look, please, at your statement, page 12, paragraph 30. You refer to three main ways in which issues or risk could be escalated up from the various parts of the department to your attention. The first was through morning meetings with the senior team, so Directors General. So in the case of Post Office, that would be information coming from shareholder executive.
Yes, that's right, if there were any.
The second was through my regular one-to-one meetings with each individual Director General. So again, that's information from shareholder executive.
As one of the DGs, yes.
The third was through the departmental top-level risk register and dashboard. Each of the Directors General contributed to this, drawing upon the risk registers held by each of their own groups, and it was updated by the departmental secretariat in between meetings. So again, that's information coming from shareholder executive.
Yes, putting together all of their information and then putting forward the most important issues that they saw for the board as a whole.
Another way matters could be raised is through Secretary of State or a junior minister. Would you agree?
Yes, because that, if you like, is the policy line. And I did not get involved in most policy areas, again, because I didn't have time, but also because I didn't usually have anything to add to what was going on, and it wouldn't have been helpful, and it could have actually made things less effective. But if ministers wanted me to focus on something, they could say so, and they did.
You also say, or another way of matters being raised with you would be through being copied into briefings.
Yes, but if I can give you a little background on that, I would get a large amount of material every evening, usually in 3 folders. One was for action for you, something I had to deal with immediately, possibly organizational, possibly a major policy issue. One would be questions of organization, diary, and so on. And there would be a third of papers you might just want to have a quick glance at to be aware of, which would be a subset of the several hundred pages and sometimes more of documents that would have come into my private office during the day. So that inevitably had to be a process of filtering. And again, I tried to stay in touch with as much information as I could, but I needed to focus on the areas that I was leading on or adding value in.
In your statement, you refer to your private office filter. Sorry, that can come down. Thank you. You refer to your private office highlighting or identifying what were the key documents. Do you know how they went about that? How they filtered out what was important to you or what wasn't?
It was a bit of an iterative process. I would say, I know that the ministers or number 10 are concerned about area X. I might have asked for something. If there were major issues around resourcing or the structure of the department, they would know that I would want to see it. But the bottom line really was I needed to be aware of issues that might produce problems for the organisation or structures of the department, like a steel crisis. How are we going to manage that? What resources were we going to have to find? Or major political issues which were causing significant difficulty, and the Royal Mail privatisation was obviously one that was politically contentious. Student loans, of course, was another. Some business crises that occurred rather regularly were another area like that. So it was really keeping me in touch with issues where I was likely to have to engage to add value or to communicate what the department had to do.
So is it fair to infer from what you're saying, it's unlikely that they would have raised post office issues with you or on the horizon matters because they obviously weren't taking up, well, your evidence is they weren't taking up your time when you were permanent secretary?
Yes, because they were being handled in a straightforward, it seemed, way, up to the relevant minister, and there was nothing additional coming from shareholder executive to say, red flag here.
So that's, we're making very good progress. That's probably a good time to take a break, though, for the afternoon. I wonder if you could come back at 3:05.
Certainly, yeah.
Thank you, sir. Sir, can you see and hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the timeline now, starting in 2012. Following pressure from MPs, Post Office instructed Second Sight to conduct a review, which I'm sure you're aware of now. I want to look at an email, please, UKGI 401424. So this is from Mike Whitehead. If we just go down slightly to see the signature, please. See, within the department, shareholder executive. Do you recall Mr. Whitehead?
Vaguely.
He is, it's hard to tell here because of the redactions, but he is emailing Mike Granville at Post Office and others, and it says, I understand through Will, you see in the CC line that we have a Will Gibson, also shareholder executives. I understand through Will that Alice has asked us to agree a defensive line if pressed on the Cabinet Office commissioning the independent review, as advocated in Andrew Bridgen quote yesterday. It says, how about, this is an operational matter for Post Office Limited, who have already commissioned an independent external review by forensic accountants. Were you told about the commissioning of the Second Sight review at the time?
No, not that I recall at all.
In this email, what's being discussed is a Member of Parliament, Andrew Bridgen, seeking an independent review commissioned by the Cabinet Office into an IT system that was used by a public corporation your department sponsored. Is that something that should have been raised with you as Permanent Secretary?
I think in these sorts of issues, I would expect the senior officials involved to take a judgment as to why that might need to be the case or not.
But he's taken a judgment, and my question is, looking at it, is that the type of issue that you would expect to have been raised with you?
No. Given the range and complexity of the department, I would have not expected that to be the case unless someone more senior in the shareholder executive felt that it raised difficult issues which were of wider concern.
So what we have here is the commissioning of an independent review or seeking of a review commissioned by the Cabinet Office. The software is the software that produces Post Office's accounts on which it prosecutes people. Why is that not serious enough to be raised with you in circumstances where earlier you referred to a accounting issue on the late filing of accounts being raised with you?
Well, the accounting point was a direct issue for the overall credibility of the department's accounting, for which I was personally responsible to Parliament. So I had a close concern with the quality of accounting, both because of the credibility to Parliament and because I wanted to make sure the department had the highest standards of accounting. Now, the Post Office's accounting systems were separate because of their status. Nonetheless, there was a reputational issue there. I hadn't seen this. It looks as though someone outside government is suggesting there should be a Cabinet Office review. The issue of substance for the shareholder executive is whether that would be justified on its merits. If they don't think it is, and if they believe that the Post Office independent external review referred to deals suitably with the issue, I would not have expected them to raise it with me, because what wider issue are they saying it raises? I'd only expect them to come to me if they thought that the Post Office review was not going to be effective or sufficiently independent or find out the evidence that was required. And then the question would be, well, how do you do that? But that wasn't their view at the time.
Thank you. That document can come down. That leads to the interim report. We don't need to bring it up, but at paragraph 84 of your statement, you refer to a number of documents that the inquiry sent to you that you did not have sight of.
That's right.
At the time. You don't mention the interim report within there. Were you aware of the publication of the interim report at the time it was published in July 2013?
No, I have no recollection of that crossing my desk in any substantive way. My office would have been copied into the fact it was coming out, but I did not spend any time focusing on it, and I have no recollection of it.
Joe Swinson, the junior minister, made a statement to Parliament on the interim report on the 9th of July 2013. Does that in itself show it was a matter of some significance to the department?
It showed it was a matter of some significance to the department, but not out of the ordinary. There were statements being made several times a week by junior ministers. We had 5 rising to 7. This was a normal part of business. A whole range of statements would be made on every occasion that Parliament was sitting. Occasionally, they would involve the Secretary of State in major issues. I'd come back to the Royal Mail as one of those. Junior ministers, that was part of their job and their normal responsibilities.
The inquiry heard evidence from Jo Swinson, and that she was told that Post Office Limited had commissioned external lawyers to review past prosecutions following the interim report. Does that not make it a level of significance where past prosecutions by the corporation are being reviewed, where it's so significant that you should have had sight of it or been involved in it in some way?
In retrospect, obviously, these were important moments. At the time, this was a standard junior minister reporting on an issue. The shareholder executive team did not flag this up, and I'm sure in good faith, on the basis that they did not see anything substantively significant out of the normal process of a review being commissioned in an area and followed up and so on, as happened in a lot of areas across our area of government and more widely. So it would have required someone to say, this is actually significant for the following reasons. Otherwise, it would have been a normal bit of government business.
I mean, you say with retrospect, trying to put yourself in the position at the time, with what you knew then, is it not something you think you should have been informed of? It's
difficult, knowing what we know now, to go back to then. All I would say is that I had confidence in the teams dealing with these areas, and if their judgment, and they were closer to this than I was, and this wouldn't just have been true of the shareholder executive, it would have been true elsewhere, unless I had some very powerful additional information which would mean that I felt I had a legitimate role in challenging what was going on, I would not do so, both because I didn't think it would have been professional and because it wasn't possible across the range of the department. Now, our legal team could have picked up on something unusual and didn't, and of course lawyers would have been involved. In other areas, the finance team might have picked up on something, but I have to say that would not have been close to being something that I would have been concerned about without additional input.
Can we look, please, at UKGI 401834? It's an email from Tim McInnes at Shareholder Executive, the 10th of July 2013, so 2 days after the interim report is published and a day after Jo Swinson's statement in Parliament. It's to the private officers of the Secretary of State, Sir Vince Cable, and Jo Swinson. And in CC, we see PermSec Biz. Now, is that your private office?
Yes.
And it says, ahead of the meeting with Post Office tomorrow at 12 o'clock, please see attached a briefing that covers some background to the session and highlights areas that Post Office management will be keen to cover off. So referring to a meeting between Post Office, Secretary of State and Jo Swinson. Is that something, is that the type of meeting you would have assisted the Secretary of State with?
No.
Why not?
Because it was a straightforward policy meeting with the junior minister and the Secretary of State dealing with several issues related to a specific organisation. There was no wider engagement of the department, and it wouldn't have been possible or arguably helpful for me to have attended all of the meetings that the Secretary of State held dealing with policy, because I didn't have specific additional value to add. This is how the system was supposed to work.
If you'd had, well, no, let me ask one question first. At this point, how much time was spent by you on the issues relating to cuts, which you referred to earlier?
I think that summer a very large amount, including coming in at weekends and so on, because there was a difficult negotiation with the Treasury over how much capital and current spending we were likely to get, which meant that some of our programmes could not have continued if the initial figures we were given had been the final ones. So there was a very difficult, complex negotiation at official level and at ministerial level to try to ensure that we could go on functioning to do what we'd been asked to do. And that was taking up a lot of my time, yes.
Now, is it your evidence that you wouldn't have been involved in these sorts of issues even if you'd had the time, for example, so you didn't have to deal with the cuts? This just isn't the level of priority that you're dealing with? Or was it because you didn't have enough time to deal with it?
Essentially, as I've tried to set out in my evidence statement, my job with the department as we had it was to ensure the systems and culture were in place, to be effective, supportive, to give people the time and resources to do their jobs, and also to connect with the Secretary of State, with the Prime Minister, with a range of stakeholders, and manage key critical policy issues where additional input was needed because, for example, a critical industry might require additional emergency help, and that would involve the Treasury in 10 Downing Street and so on. So for policy issues which ministers were being briefed on and were engaging with, I would not normally have got involved because that wasn't how the system was designed to work, given what we were trying to do. And it wouldn't have been efficient for me to try to jump into issues I didn't know much about or I knew less about than the people doing the briefing. Unless, and this is an important caveat of course, there was some question over whether the briefing was correct or whether there had been an argument with the minister or whether there were wider implications or whether 10 Downing Street were involved, only if there was something else going on. And even then, my first port of call would always have been to the senior officials to say, are we happy with this? What's happening? Have we thought about these options? You know, have you got it under control?
The inquiry's heard evidence about the Simon Clarke advice of the 15th of July 2015, and you say in your statement that you didn't see that at the time.
I have no recollection of that, no.
Have you read his advice as part of the documents that the inquiry sent to you?
What was it on again?
If we can bring it up. It's
yes, if you could.
POL 406357. So it's an advice on the use of expert evidence relating to the integrity of the, should say, Fujitsu Services Limited Horizon system. And if we turn to page 13, we see conclusions. What does this all mean? In short, it means Dr. Jennings, that should be Gareth Jenkins, the expert witness used in many of the trials, in a trial and who provided witness evidence, has not complied with his duties to the court, the prosecution or the defence. It is pertinent to recall the test under which a prosecution expert labours, and it goes on. So Mr. Clarke is advising, in his view, that Gareth Jenkins had breached expert duties. Have you read or are aware now of the content of that advice?
I am now aware of it, yes. I was not then.
That can come down. The inquiry will in due course determine who was aware of that advice at the time. Assuming, and this is assuming, that advice had made its way into the department and an official had it in the department, would you have expected as permanent secretary to be briefed on the contents of that advice or the gist of it?
I would have expected to have been briefed as the consequences of this became clear, yes, that actually potentially large number of criminal cases, and I'm not a lawyer, so I may not use the terms accurately here, were completely unsafe, and that nothing had been done about this. And indeed, and I would have been most concerned about this, in addition, obviously, to the human implications, that there would have appeared to have been a cover-up in a public sector organisation of this type of material. I mean, that's absolutely nuclear. How on earth could this have happened?
Just focusing on the content of the advice, if at the time that it had been provided to you and you're aware of Mr. Clark's advice and on his view that Mr. Jenkins had breached expert duties to the court, what would you have done as permanent secretary, if anything?
Well, I would have wanted our departmental lawyers, and presumably the shareholder executive lawyers in the first instance, to get to grips with this and to make sure that those of us who weren't lawyers fully understood the implications of what was being said here. And following on from that, how many cases were involved. And I would have wanted the legal redress system to have worked immediately. Probably, and we are in a hypothetical territory here, but my responsibility and my main concern would then have been, assuming that was all going on as rapidly as possible, how on earth did this happen? And what does this tell us about the organisation we are dealing with? And we have all these layers of management and boards and so on, and yet this could have been overlooked, hidden, whatever. It would have suggested to me that we had a massively dysfunctional organisation, and there would have been a lot of consequences to have been discussed, obviously with ministers as well, because rightly this would become a public scandal, as it should have, and we had responsibility for an organisation which was not anywhere near to fulfilling not just the Nolan principles, but normal commercial behaviour. So, it would have absolutely been, you ring the alarm bell and you start doing stuff about the organisation as well as the miscarriages of justice that may have arisen.
I want to move on slightly in the chronology and look at the sale of Royal Mail, which you were involved with. To what extent, if at all, were you involved in matters such as the content of the prospectus of the Royal Mail sale, the IPO?
Not at all. That was not my area of expertise or responsibility. It was precisely what the shareholder executive was set up to do and bring in expertise as necessary. My role, very clearly, was when they had done their jobs, and I remember having them in and saying, you do your work. Your job is not to sell the Royal Mail. It's to let me know whether you think it's value for money and what the evidence is. And if it isn't value for money and we don't sell it, then you've done your job all the same. So don't push it in the wrong direction. You've got to be objective about this. But that was my job.
Did anyone raise with you during the sale or discuss with you anything to do with Horizon claims or the Horizon IT system at all?
No, I have no recollection of that at all coming up.
Did you have to take, as part of your assessment of whether it was value for money, etc., did you have to investigate or look at any of the due diligence in respect of the sale?
No, I expected all that to have been done by the shareholder executive. Again, it was their core activity, and I had every reason to assume they would do it efficiently and no reason to assume that there was any question about it, not least because this was a commercial document.
Could we look, please, at... Well, no, first I want to turn to some meetings you had with Alice Perkins. Firstly, how often did you meet Alice Perkins in your role as Permanent Secretary?
So I think we have in the papers pretty much all of them. I think it was about once a year. And I think on the first occasion it was with Paula Venables, and that's the only meeting with Paula Venables that I can recall. And after that it was just with Alice Perkins.
Did, when you met Alice Perkins, did she raise or discuss with you the role of the shareholder non-executive director?
I have a vague recollection of this from the first meeting, and I was briefed that she was not entirely happy with that. I knew both the shareholder executive and our ministers thought that it was the right thing to do, and I quite wanted her to think that she was happy with it. I only had limited sympathy with her concerns, to be honest. I thought it wasn't appropriate not to have a shareholder executive non-exec director, but I don't recall that there was a difficult discussion on it in the meeting.
Do you recall what her reasons were? You say you weren't impressed with them. What were they?
I don't have a clear recollection, and so this may be from the briefing, that she and perhaps some of the post office team were worried there would be too much intervention in their day-to-day or operational business.
Did you have any discussion about the type of information that the shareholder non-executive director could pass back to the department?
No, it wasn't that level of discussion. I know the shareholder executive did look at whether there were limited issues on which there might be a case for their non-exec director recusing him or herself, but that did not come up at my level. I expected it to be an additional level of transparency and connectivity with what was going on in the post office.
Could we look, please, at base 5010? That's BEIS 5010. Thank you. So it's a briefing from Peter Batten to you. Do you recall working with Peter Batten?
Not in detail, no.
So it's for a meeting on the 8th of April, and the recommendations summarise the point lines to take, and at the bottom says note risks on the Valuation Office Agency and Horizon Working Group. And then if we turn to page 3, please. You see it says all in-branch transactions performed by sub-postmasters and post office staff are recorded by Post Office's accounting software known as Horizon. Shortly after joining Post Office, and in response to persistent grumblings by a small number of former sub-postmasters, Alice commissioned a review of the integrity of the Horizon system. An independent report published in July 2013 found there were no systemic issues with the software, but made recommendations about Post Office's training and support processes. Following the report, Post Office had worked to establish a working group under an independent chair that has set up a mediation process for former sub-postmasters who feel wronged by the Horizon system. And it goes on to provide details of the working group. Can you recall what you thought when you read that?
No, I did read it, and it was not the major point for the meeting. In fact, it was some way down the briefing, and as far as I can remember, it did not come up. The fact that I read it and didn't feel there was anything requiring action for me was not surprising given what is said there. And I was equally concerned about the Valuation Office Agency risks mentioned, but these were points for me to note at that stage. There was no suggestion that I should raise them with Alice or that there were wider concerns.
Knowing what you know now, do you think that is a fair and full briefing?
No.
would you have expected the briefing to include details of the review of past prosecutions?
There is this difference between knowing what we know now and knowing what the shareholder executive in good faith knew at the time, and I want to be clear about that. I'm sure they were writing this in good faith at the time. It is one example of when more information could have been provided, and the fact that it wasn't reflected, I think, the shareholder executive's view that this was not a major issue, particularly compared with the other ones, which they already mentioned, mutualisation and the change in status of various postmasters and the finances, all of which were very live, ongoing issues.
Do you think the language that we see, and in response to persistent grumblings by a small number of former sub-postmasters, is that the sort of language you would expect in a briefing describing the types of complaints that were being made through the mediation scheme?
I would say that it was not a fair description of what had been happening over so many years in the context of just mentioning it briefly at the end of a brief for a meeting, which was essentially for me to listen to Alice and just have a bit of background. It's a sort of, I wouldn't say it was a major failing, but it could certainly have been put better, yes.
And can you assist with why it may have been put in that way?
No, except I assume, as I say, I'm sure the briefers were working in good faith, but this must have reflected their views at the time.
That can come down, thank you. If you'd been told at that point, prior to your briefing with Alice Perkins, that there had previously been a review of criminal convictions and that the CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, was in contact with Post Office, would it have changed your approach to the meeting with Alice Perkins?
The meeting with Alice Perkins was one of an annual series of, let's just touch base on how it's all going. You can tell me anything on your mind. It wasn't an operational meeting in that sense. So I would have expected that to have been followed up in the first instance by the shareholder executive with the relevant parts of the Post Office. If they had not been satisfied with the result, then they could have briefed me for that meeting to say something like, be aware we have an outstanding issue with the Post Office here where we're not happy with what has been going on and you ought to flag up our concerns and this is what we plan to do next. Without that, it isn't the sort of material or the sort of meeting in which I would have expected that issue to have come up, as it were, at that just on those terms.
Can we look, please, at poll 20116554. We go down to the bottom of the page, please. This is not an email you would have seen at the time. It's internal to Post Office from Belinda Crowe to Martin Edwards on the 12th of May 2014. It says, as requested, please find below a note for Paula including recent activity, a timeline of upcoming events for the scheme, a suggestion for the date of the next board subcommittee in light of the above, and some suggested names of people for Paula to consider with whom she might discuss the Tony Hooper meeting, referring there to Sir Anthony Hooper, the chair of the working group. If we go over the page, please, and further down. It says discussion with an external sounding board ahead of meeting Tony Hooper. And at number 4, your name. It says at some point we'll need to engage with this issue and getting an early perspective understanding may be a useful side effect. were you ever approached by Paula Venables or someone else at Post Office to discuss the working group or Sir Anthony Hooper?
No, not that I recall, no.
What we can see here is internally within Post Office, the view that you'll need to be engaged at some point. Was that ever made known to you?
No.
The mediation scheme itself and the proposed changes to it and closing the working group, are those matters that you think should have been raised with you as Permanent Secretary?
Well, I think, again, there's a distinction between what we know now and what we knew at the time. On the basis that this was a process being managed by the Post Office, supervised by the shareholder executive, ministers being kept informed, I can understand why it wasn't highlighted to me.
Can we look, please, at WITN 208000100? This is Mark Russell's witness statement to the inquiry, and page 6, paragraph 16, please. It says the appointment of shareholder non-executive directors complements but does not replace the primary points of departmental contact. In the case of Post Office Limited, the key contacts were between the Post Office CEO and 1, the Minister, and 2, the Permanent Secretary Accounting Officer. Such meetings provide senior members of the department with a direct line of sight into the ALB and are a key mechanism for reinforcing departmental objectives for the ALB. Would you agree with that?
Not in precisely those terms, no, because we had over 40 arm's length bodies of very different types with different challenges, and it was clearly not practical, or I would argue desirable, for there to be key contacts between those chief executives and me as the Permanent Secretary or my successors or predecessors, because it would not be a professional way of doing business. I would interpret this as meaning officials reporting to the Permanent Secretary. And of course, in this case, those officials were within the shareholder executive. I can understand it in that perspective.
You said, I think you said in your evidence earlier you met once with Paula Venables.
Yes.
Did you ever discuss with Mr. Russell your level of contact with Post Office directly?
No, because, again, apart from the meetings I had with Alice Perkins, which I did not do with most of the chairs, the Post Office was obviously a larger and more significant organisation, and I thought that was therefore appropriate. I would have done so had the shareholder executive wanted me to do so, and at no point did they say that they did.
I want to look now at how shareholder executive handled matters. If we could go still in Mark Russell's statement, please, but go to paragraph 214, page 94. Mr. Russell says, when I did learn that Post Office was undertaking its own prosecutions, I also took some comfort that, in spite of the Post Office-led prosecution policy, the courts were making criminal convictions with a strict standard of proof that is applied, and that there had been few appeals. Wrongly, I did not consider the risk of unsafe convictions as a result of failings in the Horizon system to be significant, in large part because of the repeated and categorical assurances that the Post Office had provided to shareholder executive, UKGI, and others about the Horizon system. And then if we could look over the page at 217, please. It says the strong assertions made to ministers in submissions around the integrity of Horizon were wrong and make for uncomfortable reading now. At the very least, the submissions should have been clearer that the views were the views of Post Office and that they needed to be balanced by alternative points of view. The submissions may have led to ministers being too cautious in their engagement on Horizon, but as mentioned above, their direct involvement and clear determination to pursue their own courses may have meant that this advice had any particular impact or consequence. That can come down, thank you. And we have that. We also have in Mr. Callard's evidence of the inquiry, he accepted that he wasn't curious enough and showed undue deference to what Post Office was telling him. With reflection, do you think there's anything the department could have done to in terms of oversight of shareholder executive to correct these issues that they identify, a lack of curiosity and not identifying the right issues at Post Office?
Again, I find this a difficult question to answer, which I have reflected on. The challenge of adding additional layers is if you do not have additional information on which to base your challenge, it can merely add bureaucracy and actually make it more difficult to get at the facts, which is why earlier on I mentioned that I thought if we'd had more resource, having more resource at expert level connected with the detail and following it up was perhaps one of the areas where this did not work. It also did not work through various levels of management, and it did not work through the Post Office board. The difficulty I have is that inside the business department as it was, and one of the consequences of the range of responsibilities was that I was perhaps submerged in managing all of this all the time. I wasn't as out there in the wider world as I might have been, but it's very difficult to see how you manage a structure which isn't getting the information it needs if no one is challenging at the basis of the information provision. Because the problem of having an extra layer or an extra set of questions is we would have received the same answers that ministers got. The truth is that we did not, inside the department, manage to pick up on what was going on inside the Post Office in these areas, and that is a matter of huge regret and had awful consequences over very many years. But the people involved at senior levels, I have said in my statement, and I believe, were competent and professional. I do not see any lack of that in terms of the people who were making those decisions. So it's not clear to me that adding another level would necessarily have produced a different result. And I come back to this problem of how do you deal with a department which is not, with an organisation like the Post Office which is not following the standards of honesty and integrity, at least in these issues, which you tend to rely on, and you're not really resourced to second guess. Now, I don't think that's a good enough excuse for what happened, but I think it is what happened.
The inquiry's heard evidence from Richard Callard, and there's an email we can go to. He received something called the Deloitte report, which, in fact, let's bring that up, please. It's POL 30 28069. You say in your evidence that you didn't receive this document at the time. Are you now aware of it, or it's...
I'm aware of it in outline. I haven't read it in detail.
So there were initial findings made on Fujitsu's ability to access remotely branch account data. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And this was sent to Richard Callard by email. And if it wasn't raised, do you think this document should have been raised with you or raised within the department?
Well, knowing what we know now, it definitely should have been raised further within, first of all, the shareholder executive, and then I would hope more widely, because the question I draw from this, and it's for you and the inquiry to decide, of course, is that at what stage did all of these different pieces of evidence amount to, really, we've got this wrong, the scales have shifted, and why did we not pick that up? And I think that is the challenge which bothers me most about the professionalism of how we handled this. There were too many occasions where something else came in, but it was never connected properly. It wasn't raised. The post office were, of course, just sticking to various positions that they held. And we didn't ever get to the stage inside the organisation of saying, you know, we've really got to not just talk about having a zero-based review or an independent review. We've got to get right to the bottom of this and take as much time and spend as much money as is needed.
Well, that can come down. Thank you. You've said the part of your evidence is that there was a lack of information flowing from post office to the department. The point you've just made there is within the department itself, connecting the dots and acting on it, on the information it had. On reflection, having heard what you've heard, can you assist us in any way by way of recommendations as to how, if it was done again, the department could have put those things together and could have acted differently?
I wish I could come up with an easy answer to that question. It looks to me, knowing what we know now and having read everything that I've read, and the great work that went on to write this injustice, that one of the problems was it had lasted so long. So there was never a moment when people went back to the beginning and said, but hold on, you know, there's always been issues here, and they then just got used to accepting the assurances that were being given. And, of course, then there were a series of reviews and so on. And everyone said, well, we're looking into this or whatever. But we didn't step back and say, but fundamentally, you know, either the people raising all these issues over all these years are, you know, dishonest or completely deluded, or there's something here we haven't got to. And we relied too much on the post office to do it. And inside the department, this was one of our silos. And it didn't get out of that. So I struggle to see how we could have better picked that up. Obviously, people could have performed and should have performed better at various times in various ways. In overall structures, I think I'd come back to we should have had more people in detail marking the post office and accepting that that was against all of the movement towards arm's length bodies, commercial responsibility, avoiding micromanagement. And we should have said, this is too important to leave it to the organisation, as long and in as many ways as happened.
I want to look at one last topic, please. It's late 2015 now. Can we look at UKGI 3017443? we look at page 3, please? So this is from Mark Russell, a shareholder executive, to other shareholder executive officials. It says some negative feedback from BNR, I take that to be Baroness Neville Rolfe, on shareholder executive, I'm afraid in connection with GIB and PO Post Office, came through Martin. Would that be you?
Yes.
Can you recall what Baroness Neville Rolfe said to you or emailed you?
Not in detail. It was not unusual for me to chat to junior ministers about how things were going over a cup of tea, and particularly with a new group as we had after the election. It was also not unusual for officials to come to me and say, you know, we're having a bit of an issue with Minister X on this, and I would see what I could do to ensure that the system worked better, taking both sides' legitimate concerns into account. In this occasion, Baroness Neville Rolfe, who was a very experienced minister and had a lot of commercial experience, raised these issues with me, and as far as I can recall, because it was something I did as part of my normal job, I spoke either that day or probably the next morning, to Mark, and I made, I think, the points that he has accurately put down there. I passed them on, and I didn't hear any more. So, as in other such cases, I assumed that action had been taken, communication properly restored, and things were going on in a satisfactory way.
This was at a time when Baroness Neville Rolfe had asked Tim Parker to commission or carry out an independent review, and at this point, Jonathan Swift QC, as he then was reviewing the situation. If we go to page 2, please, at the bottom, we see that Richard Callard's email in response says, "Marvellous, yes, we can give you a full briefing. The problem is we cannot deliver what she wants, a green-lock GIB and a post office without a perceived but non-existent IT problem." We, of course, know that it wasn't simply a perceived IT problem.
No.
Was it the case that Baroness Neville Rolfe had raised with you concerns about shareholder executives' handling of the Horizon issues?
I cannot recall in detail. I do think that the previous email's account was accurate. I think she did say that they were too technocratic and they weren't aware of the politics around some of these post office issues. I can't remember whether she specifically mentioned Horizon or not.
You said that I think you said you left it after this and didn't do anything further.
Well, I did what she asked me to, and what I said I would do, which was to raise it with shareholder executive, with Mark as the head of the shareholder executive, pass on the concerns, and then it was up to him to follow up, and there was follow-up, and I did not hear any more from the minister.
But in your role as permanent secretary, was it not incumbent on you to see that the concerns had been addressed and follow up on them?
Well, insofar as I can recall, Mark said that he would follow this up, and he did. And as with other such issues, I did not hear any more of a problem, so I assumed that it was being managed.
Could we look, please, at UKGI 406366? And if we go to page 3, please. It's an email from the then Secretary of State, Sajid Javid's private office regarding the restatement of accounts. So it's the issue we discussed earlier, and reporting what the Secretary of State wanted from it. We see your private office is in copy. So presumably this these emails would have been raised with you, given you were hands-on, as it were, on this issue?
Yes, I'm sure I saw this, and I think I may have written something about the restatement of accounts point. I certainly followed up with our own finance people and with the shareholder executive and made clear my annoyance at what had happened and desire to ensure it wasn't going to happen again, which was the other key point.
And this is so December 2015, so the next month on from the last email we saw. If we go to page 1, please, further up the chain. We have an email from Baroness Neville Rolfe's private office. Again, we see you're in copy, or your private office is in copy. But again, it's likely you would have seen this because you were involved with the issue. Would you agree?
Probably.
And what is reported from Baroness Neville Rolfe to have said is, these are very disappointing developments on top of earlier difficulties in the post office with the Horizon IT system. The good news is that we have a new chairman, Tim Parker, and 2 new non-execs, Carla Stent and Ken McCall. Carla Stent will chair the Audit, Risk and Compliance Committee, and Ken McCall, the Senior Independent Director. Tim is working on these issues with their management, and I've discussed the matter with Mark Russell, who is engaged with this issue. I will be kept informed on matters progressing. So it's evident that Baroness Neville Rolfe is still concerned about the Horizon issues.
And she is taking it forward in a way which she found satisfactory, and that was positive.
Why, at this stage, did you not seek to follow up on it when it had been raised by a junior minister as a matter of importance?
Because I had already followed up on it with Mark Russell. What we see here is what is now happening, and the fact that there was the new corporate governance level, and that Mark and team were engaged, and that the minister notes that. So that is what the system is meant to be doing, and so now this takes place. So from my point of view, that's what should be happening, and it is happening.
So from your perspective, within the department, it's being handled by the relevant body, shareholder executive, and that's the department functioning properly?
Correct.
They can come down. I have a couple of questions on just your reflections generally. The inquiry's heard evidence recommending that ministers should have express powers to involve themselves in decision-making in arm's-length bodies. What do you say to that?
That's quite a sweeping comment. I think essentially ministers always did have power. They could, for example, have said to a chief executive or a chair, and occasionally this happened across government, I believe, you no longer have my confidence, in which case it would have been impossible for the person to carry on. I think the point is perhaps a slightly more nuanced one. It's how easy was it for ministers to engage on issues below that rather excessively dramatic, risk the board resigning or whatever level. And in my experience, ministers did, as they should have been allowed to ask probing questions, expect to get responses from the relevant organisations, not just the Post Office, but more widely, and where these issues were politically sensitive or raised other issues, they could be very forensic and concrete. So I'm not sure myself that there is an issue about a lack of power, though it perhaps would be better to be explicit about that. But in my experience, ministers did think and did behave as though they had access to the organisation and could query its decisions.
The inquiry's heard evidence about the use of risk registers, both at the corporate level with Post Office and in shareholder executive, and indeed, you said in your witness evidence with the department. And I understand from your evidence is the the department risk register didn't refer to the Horizon issues as a risk.
No, it was much higher level. So if you look at one of the report and accounts, you can see the sort of risks because we write them in the report. There were things like the 2020 change programme, the 30% cuts, apprenticeship targets, higher education funding and accountability, student loan company, capacity, partner board appointments. It was those sorts of levels of issue, and those are all set out in the accounts.
On reflection, do you think there's any changes you could... Sorry, I'll restart that. Do you think there's any changes or any benefit in amending or changing the way in which risks are identified and reported within the department?
Well, risk registers, as I think others have said, are basically a management tool. And there were plenty of risk registers at a devolved level inside the shareholder executive, in other parts of the department, so that those devolved levels of responsibility were working with the more granular risks. I don't think that there is a particular solution to having a huge risk register. In my experience, that doesn't work well. The challenge is, once you've identified risks at different levels, well, how are you dealing with them, and how do you use that to produce a more effective outcome?
And finally, you've referred in your statement to a suggestion of implementing the Nolan principles into Post Office or a similar public corporation. How do you think that would have helped in this situation?
Well, I put it there just as an example of perhaps being explicit, but the problem I have personally with that is it shouldn't be necessary to say that. Public servants understand. Those of us who join the public sector do so on the basis we want to work ethically and effectively. So I think it's perhaps useful to remind people of them, but signing up shouldn't make a difference because it ought to be implicit in everything everyone does. And obviously we're all imperfect and we don't manage to do it as well as we should, but it's just a core responsibility of anybody working in public services.
Those are all the questions I have. Sir, I think there are questions from core participants. Yes, from Hudgels and from HJA as well. Do you have any questions before I hand over to the floor?
No, let the co-participants go.
So Martin, I'm acting on behalf of a group of sub-postmasters, and I want to talk about a very important year for the Horizon scandal, 2013. And in that summer, just for context, we have both the Second Sight report being published and also the Clark advice that you've looked at earlier and that you pointed out would have been nuclear if it had come to your department and been dealt with as it should have been. Also important in that year was the network transformation programme, and Post Office was securing 640 million over a 3-year period. That's right, isn't it? You were kept abreast of that, weren't you?
In broad terms, yes. I don't recall the precise figure.
And it was all part of trying to keep 11,500 branches going. Again, you may not remember that figure, but that was part of the overall package, wasn't it? Well, in April of that year, internal documents show that the Post Office was looking at making a change in direction for the network transformation programme, which is perhaps emblematic of the Post Office attitude towards sub-postmasters, because they were going to move from a voluntary process to a compulsory process whereby they compelled sub-postmasters to move their branches into the network transformation programme. And internal documents made free use of that word compulsion. This was an issue, not least because ministers in your department had already publicly committed to the process being voluntary. And in light of what came up in the Common Issues trial about the relationship between Post Office and sub-postmasters, would you agree this rather goes to the heart of the way that the Post Office behave towards sub-postmasters, this attitude of compulsion?
Well, I I read one of the documents just recently which referred to that. I think it was a PR document, and I found the tone distasteful, frankly. Beyond that, I was aware that this was an important issue politically for ministers, and I didn't know that the Post Office was talking to itself in those terms.
Shall we look at that document? Because I suspect I know which one you're talking about. It's poll 302 7540. And if we could go, please, to page 33. This is an annex to a document that was presented to the board by their communications director called Mark Davies, and I see you're nodding, so I think we're on the right document. Yes. And Mark Davies presented the paper to the board saying, well, we want to move to compulsion and we need to know how we're going to deal with that from a communications point of view. And what we see here is his Annex A, first paragraph. The following script seeks to set out how we could try to sell compulsion to ministers with a view to how they might sell it on to other elements of government, parliament and the media. So clearly that's quite direct at the start there, isn't it? Suggesting that this is about selling compulsion. It's a frank introduction, isn't it, shall we say?
Well, as I say, I didn't find the tone or, frankly, the content of this piece particularly impressive.
Well, if we just go down, we can see that there's a contrast, isn't there, between the language of the introduction and then if we go down to the paragraph, it means continuing. This is the script that he wants to sell. It means continuing the existing network transformation plan, which has so far introduced whatever number of new post offices with longer opening hours, modern environments, but introducing a planned approach which will mean new models will be introduced alongside compensation for existing sub-postmasters who leave the business. This is the way he wants to dress up the compulsion. Is that fair?
Well, my concern with this was simply that ministers' decisions were respected and that the process worked professionally and loyally to do that. So, as I say, when I read this document, I was very unimpressed.
Yes, because in fact in Annex D, we don't necessarily need to go to it, page 37, Mr Davies actually sets out all those occasions when the ministers committed to a voluntary process. So in other words, this is a script that he seeks to suggest Post Office can sell to the ministers, sell to the department to change ministers' policies and to change the stance that they've taken publicly. It looks, doesn't it, as if he wanted to keep the compulsion element covert.
Well, I think it's difficult for me to comment on an internal PR Post Office document. As I say, my concern was to ensure that ministers absolutely had the information they needed and then the decisions they took on this and other key issues were respected. And, I would expect the Post Office to respect them in spirit as well as in letter.
When we look at page 39, we see that you're actually named as one of the people that he seeks to engage in his delivery of this strategic plan. He says, in addition to regular meetings with day-to-day shareholder executive contacts, a series of meetings with key biz officials are taking place over the coming weeks. They include Howard Orme, Mark Russell, Anthony Odgers and Martin Donnelly. Do you sort of recognise this script or this mechanism that he sought to try to use to sell compulsion?
No, I do not, and I don't recall having any such meeting. I'm also aware, as I mentioned briefly, that this was a time when there was a massive amount of engagement in how the department's finances were going, which was taking up a lot of my time.
In this effort to apparently use you and your team and your ministers to carry out this sort of rather covert move to compulsion, looking back, knowing everything that we know that the Post Office was doing covertly in 2013 around Second Sight, around Horizon, what was going on internally with the Clark advice, do you think that this shows the way that Post Office was operating? It was using whatever levers it had in government to advance a covert agenda?
I'm not sure I, in all honesty, could go that far. And the Post Office obviously had the right to give their views to ministers, but I would reiterate that this does sound unpleasantly manipulative, and it's not how I think you deal with arguments. You put them in a straightforward way to people and let them respond.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Page. Next.
Thank you, sir. Sir Martin, my name is Angela Patrick. I represent with Mr Maloney KC a number of sub-postmasters who were convicted and have since had their convictions quashed, including Mrs Hamilton and Mr Trousdale, you can see near me. I want to ask you about one issue. We have looked just now at 2013. I want to go back to 2014 and ask you about one document. Have you seen the slide deck that the inquiry has been looking at with a number of witnesses, which was produced by the department under Shex to discuss that Mrs Venables was thought not to be capable of remaining in post in 2014?
I did not see it at the time.
No, I appreciate that. I'm just working on a shorthand so we can save bringing the document up. Everybody's familiar with it. If you remember, it's a PowerPoint presentation where there's a conversation about remove, retain, or retain and review. Now, you've just said that wasn't a document that was escalated up to you at the time. And you're nodding. You have to say yes or no for the transcriber.
That is correct in my recollection.
And that was dated February 2014, taken from me. Now, at that point, February 2014, Post Office has separated from Royal Mail, and of course that was an issue that had touched your desk, the flotation. And Post Office continued on, of course, with a major public subsidy, with an aim that the subsidy would be reduced and mutualisation was the goal. And again, you're nodding, Sir Martin.
I would just say that was, I believe, government policy at the time.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. Now, Miss Venables, at that time, is responsible for a partner organisation, albeit a public corporation, which was politically and socially important and dependent on a substantial government subsidy. Is that fair?
Yes.
Whether that subsidy was in safe hands and whether the Post Office would ever be in a position to operate without public support, important policy issue for the public purse, wasn't it?
Yes, and for the provision of service.
Now, ought that discussion, prompted by somebody under a Shex or a department umbrella, ought that discussion or the concern that she was simply not up to the job to have been put on your radar?
I think it was important that the shareholder executive did their job for the Post Office as for other organisations which they were sponsoring.
Can I just stop you, Sir Martin? It's a simple question. Ought it to have been put on your radar that someone under a Shex or a departmental banner thought that Miss Venables might not be up to the job?
So the point I was going to make, let me start at the other end. If they had thought the answer was yes, definitely. The idea that they were reviewing, not necessarily.
Okay, so it's a conversation that's going on at a time when the business is newly separated from Royal Mail, with the associated political significance of that process. ought that political significance ought to have been part of the consideration as to whether there was a doubt or a certainty, that question mark over Miss Reynolds ought to have been escalated up for your consideration?
It depends how big the question mark was, honestly,
Okay.
and what the alternatives were. I would have been interested to have known that. Having seen the document, I accepted that the shareholder executive would have thought, well, this is our job, this is what we do. We review people, we decide whether they're up to it or whether we get anybody better or what we can do in the middle. And since they decided not to pursue that, I can see why they didn't tell me, though I would have been, as I say, interested to know, because it's a very important job.
Okay, and of course you've talked about the judgment and the fact that you were leaving judgment to these officials. Now, this is a conversation that's occurring at a time when parliamentarians and the press are asking serious questions as to whether the Post Office had wrongly prosecuted its own people for years. It's an issue that was being investigated by the Post Office at a significant and considerable cost to the public purse. Was that an issue that ought to have factored into the judgment as to whether that doubt over Miss Reynolds' capabilities ought to have been escalated up to you?
I find that difficult to answer because the shareholder executive needed to look at, in the round, how the Post Office was being run and how far the relatively new chief executive was on top of the job. And they had, or they should have had, access to all the evidence, including the importance of the job, required to make that judgment. And they were experienced people, and I would not, honestly, at the time, have second-guessed their judgment without additional information. But the fact that they were concerned is something I would actually have liked to have known.
Okay. Now, Ms. Perkins, who was in the chair at the time, has been asked about this document, and she says that she wasn't aware of this discussion. Now, professional, senior people at Shecs who you thought could be responsible for their job, would you have expected them to have raised these concerns with the chair?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Perkins also said at the time that although the discussion wasn't raised with her, that's her evidence, that she also had doubts, including as to Miss Reynolds' personal grip on the Horizon issue. We've discussed some of your meetings with Miss Perkins, including that you were having a meeting in April 2014, sometime after this discussion. We've seen the briefing note. As an aside, can you remember if Miss Perkins raised any of her personal concerns about Miss Reynolds' capabilities in that April meeting?
It was 10 years ago, but I am pretty confident that had she done so, I would have remembered, because that is a significant issue. And in terms of the levels of control of the Post Office, the first level was the board. And so, obviously, the chair of the board's view, what's communicated or not communicated, is very, very important.
But as far as you can recall, neither Shecs nor the chair raised these concerns with you.
No.
And your view is that that really isn't something that ought to have been on your radar?
The fact that Shecs concluded that they should stick with the chief executive meant that, in a sense, there wasn't anything changing. I would have appreciated, in retrospect, knowing that they'd had that question mark. And I am surprised that they didn't contact the chair of the board on that issue, given the chair's important role in supervising, really, the chief executive.
And in 2015, when a question mark is raised by the Minister, Baroness Nelville-Rolfe, with you, as to whether Shecs is really doing its job properly, whether it's politically aware enough of the sensitivities around the post office. At no point in that conversation did anyone say, hang on a minute, last year we were talking about whether Paula was up to the job.
No.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions that I have.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think that's everyone. So we break until Tuesday morning.
Right. Well, Sir Martin, I'm very grateful to you for fielding all those questions this afternoon and for providing a witness statement. And as was pointed out to you, it was the first time that we'd heard from a permanent secretary. So thank you for that part of your witness statement, which educates me about the role of a permanent secretary. Right, we'll resume again on Tuesday as you suggest, Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, sir.